A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
In 7th grade, my Spanish class was what you'd expect, a mix of awkwardness and the laughter of preteens. But there was something about the way Mr. Alvarez ran the room that made it different. He had this peculiar method that made me both curious and uneasy. Every day, he'd use a cup filled with popsicle sticks, each labeled with a student's name, to call on kids for answers, and each time I watched how he'd dig his fingers into that cup, shuffling the sticks like a dealer in a card game, there was a creeping sensation snaking its way up my spine. The first time I heard my name called, I felt a jolt of anxiety thrumming through my veins, and while most classmates would mutter occasional groans when chosen, I never minded. I was determined to prove myself. But one Thursday morning, as he turned his back to draw a stick, I suddenly experienced an overwhelming urge, a combination of mischief and rebellion, to reach into that cup. Knowing no one was watching, I inched my fingers towards the wooden sticks, feeling them cool against my skin like marrow plunging into ice, and fished out an extra stick. It felt off, slightly hotter than it should have been, but I shoved it into my backpack as Mr. Alvarez announced who he called, blissfully unaware of the secrecy unfolding in those last moments of innocence. Just as the day lingered towards the end, a gnawing curiosity prompted me to take another peek. Feeling the popsicle stick beneath my fingers, I took it out. It was elegantly carved, and embossed into the wood was the faint silhouette of a screaming face, painfully contorted, and for a brief instant, my heart stalled. The next day, as unusual noises filled the classroom, distant hollers and stretching whispers, I decided to show my friend Leah. She gasped, eyes widening in a mix of disbelief and fright when I revealed the stick, and as I told her how I had stolen it, her brows furrowed deeply, but I brushed it off, declaring it was just a harmless trinket from the school. Still, Leah grew more uneasy, insisting that I put it back, but I dismissed her worries, feeling a strange sense of power as the stick sat proudly in my backpack. Days passed, and soon things began to shift. Mr. Alvarez's usual smile faded into something more severe, more brooding. When he turned the sticks to pick names, he'd glance into the abyss of the cup for what felt like endless moments, as if asking it for something. One afternoon while my peers shot paper at each other during lunch, the fire alarm blared, slicing through the humdrum chatter. I bolted up, heart racing. We filed outside into the freezing winter air but found ourselves lingering longer than expected. My heart plummeted when I spotted Mr. Alvarez standing alone in the doorway to the building, staring outside as if he was watching something that was only visible to him. A chill crawled down my spine. I could see tension in his shoulders. Then, he abruptly turned and descended inside, leaving us in hushed confusion. The back of my mind began to itch, questions swirling like a tornado. Why was he ignoring us? That was the same day the whispers started. Only a few classmates mentioned it at first, but soon they snowballed into panicked conversations. Fights erupted in the hallways, students claiming they had seen shadowy figures lurking near the gymnasium, students going missing. I felt trapped inside my own skin. I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the popsicle stick was somehow linked to everything that was happening. The next week, instead of ignoring what I had done, I asked Leah to come over after school to perform what I thought was a benign séance, just a silly teenage diversion to test our nerves. But the moment we lit candles around my room, she clutched my arm, eyes wild with terror, warning me that she had a bad feeling. As I called out to whatever spirits were listening, Leah went pale. The candlelight flickered with a gust that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful, until suddenly the curtain flew open, and a voice scratched against our minds, warning us to stop. It told us that the popsicle stick held a curse, that taking it was not merely a childish act. I panicked and threw it, the carving catching the bright glow as it clattered across the floor, but by that point, it felt too late. Week after week, I watched as classmates started disappearing, their names plucked from Mr. Alvarez's cup like sickly sweetness, their faces fading from memory as if they had never existed at all. The day Leah was called, I felt the panic fire up my throat, desperation clawing under my skin. When her name was framed by the popsicle stick, she turned to me, eyes pleading, and the realization hit me like 1,000 knives. Each stick was not just taken to be called on, it was a debt, and once called, the name would vanish. It struck me harder when I replayed the sentence whispered to us during the séance. The popsicle sticks were anchors of the lost souls, cursed to feed on the currency of children's lives. In horror, I watched as Leah stood, walking over to Mr. Alvarez, who seemed transfixed, but I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. I felt chained by the weight of my own dread and realization. All thoughts crumbled as I witnessed her turn to look back at me one last time, her face frozen in terror, and just like that, She was gone, another name erased from our collective memory, and the popsicle stick that once bore her identity lay abandoned in the cup. I froze in disbelief, and came to understand the true horror as Mr. Alvarez's eyes fell on me, suddenly glinting with a predator's satisfaction. He reached for another stick but paused, a slow smirk creeping onto his face, and I was certain he already knew my name. I was next, the sole survivor in this game of ravenous spirits, desperately clinging onto a borrowed moment in time, aware now that I had unearthed a darkness that belonged far beneath the surface, just waiting for a soul brave enough or foolish enough to take a single stick. I'm not proud of what I did that night, and as I sit here, blankets pulled tightly around me in this dimly lit room, the weight of my actions weighs heavy on my chest, suffocating me with each breath. It started when I decided to take a walk after a long week, the kind of stroll meant to clear your head but only led me deeper into the labyrinth of my own thoughts, contemplating my dreary existence as I passed by flickering streetlights. That's when I saw her, huddled near an alleyway, her long hair tangled and matted, skin pale and hollowed, yet there was a raw beauty about the girl, probably barely 20, with eyes that seemed to flicker with a hint of life despite her circumstance. Her name was Kelly, and though her clothes were ragged and her body trembled from the cold, she somehow managed to smile at me with a warmth that shocked my conscience back to life. I stopped, heart racing, curiosity battling the moral lessons ingrained in me, and before I knew it, I was engaged in a conversation with her, her soft voice contrasting sharply with the harsh edge of her world. She recounted stories of loss, betrayal, and the harsh realities of surviving on the streets, eliciting a strange mix of admiration and pity in me, and as I spoke to her, sharing tales of my own mundane struggles, I felt an absurd connection to this girl who had nothing. Somewhere in the bleakness of that alley, between the verses of her sad life, I found myself becoming enchanted, my heart racing under the illusion of a twisted romance, as we laughed and shared secrets unfit for our surroundings. I was lost in the moment as her hand grazed mine, and despite the growing ache of conscience, a darker urge began to bubble within. She leaned closer, and the space between us crackled with an electric tension. She said she needed help, and in an impulsive moment of weakness, I made a string of terrible decisions that led us to my car parked a few blocks down. The cramped space became charged, her presence overwhelming, the smell of stale cigarettes and unwashed clothes mixed with something raw and primal in the air. I could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, but the urgency of the moment drowned it out as she leaned in, whispering softly, and I could feel the allure of my desires clash violently with my ethics. As I surrendered to the primal instinct feeding the shadowy depths of my mind, I suddenly became hyper-aware of the risk, the fleeting thrill of the taboo feeling exhilarating, intoxicating, dangerously inviting. One moment, I was just a man, and the next, I had been reborn into something darker as she knelt before me, and I was helpless against the allure of the situation. There, in the confinement of my car, morality and reality blurred, tugging at my chest as I lost myself in the forbidden act, revulsion battling with exhilaration, leaving a taste so bitter and sweet it nearly consumed me whole. And yet, as the might of shame washed over me afterward like a tidal wave, I realized the girl was simply a fragment of my own delusions, a vessel to challenge my values, and I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that I had done more than just indulge in a moment of weakness. I had violated the very humanity I claimed to uphold. After it was over, her eyes held something I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of gratitude for the fleeting escape I had given her and a deeper sorrow for the life she had led and a life she knew would not allow her a better end. She slipped out of my car like a ghost, her silhouette merging into the shadows of the streets, and I was left staring at the vacant passenger seat, my blood still raging against the fraying edges of my morality, paralyzed by the haunting vision of her now faded smile and the whispered implications of my choices. I drove home in a daze, the streets transformed into a blur of red lights and darkened corners where I imagined other souls may be lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to ensnare those naive enough to cross their paths. Now, the silence of my room has been shattered by the chorus of my mistakes echoing in my mind, and I can't stop replaying that night like a broken record, the details sharp and clear, her laughter, her touch, the focus of my desires, the contemplation of a life I will never fully understand. I know that I should feel no remorse in the darkness, that somewhere she was still out there, yet the shadows cast by my actions loom larger than life, breeding something ugly in the fertile soil of my regret. The girl I almost saved has transformed into a specter who haunts my conscience, feeding a gnawing dread that leaves me reeling in guilt, wanting to seek redemption but fearing that the real horror might lie waiting in the alleyways, mirrored back at me in the faces of all those I ignore every day. Now, as I sit here, trembling with the weight of my decisions, I can't help but wonder if after that night, I still have the right to look anyone in their eyes, Or if I've become the reflection of all that I despise, a thoughtless monster lurking beneath the surface, masked by the guise of a moral man, driven by instincts I thought had long been buried but now dance menacingly just out of reach.
Growing up, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. It always meant a table overflowing with food, laughing family members, and the warm scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. However, this year was different. My family had grown distant, caught up in life's responsibilities, jobs, and whatever else life threw our way. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. So when my sister texted a week before the holiday to say she'd be hosting Thanksgiving, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I immediately assumed I'd at least bring dessert or contribute in some way, but when I asked her whether I should pick up a pie, she responded with a strange silence that pinched at my gut. Finally, she texted back, "It's fine, just come," leaving me in a pit of uncertainty. As Thanksgiving approached, I tried my best to prepare mentally. I envisioned my family around the table, laughing over stories from past Thanksgivings, feeling full and happy as I enjoyed their company. Then, I wondered if I could really afford to pitch in this year. I didn't want to seem cheap, but the thought of struggling to make rent mixed with the guilt of not being able to contribute gnawed at me. The evening of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and clear, and I arrived at my sister's house, trying to remember what it felt like for everyone to get together. As I walked through the door, a delicious aroma hit me. The turkey, roasted to perfection, mingled with the sweetness of cranberry sauce and buttery rolls. For a heartbeat, everything felt perfect, and then I noticed something strange. My sister had a pinched smile plastered on her face, and the guests, a mixture of my siblings and their partners, seemed uncharacteristically tense, the clinking of forks muffling the chatter that should have filled the room. I tried to shake off my unease and joined in, eager to dig into the feast. But soon enough, after a few awkward exchanges, my sister announced that a sudden rise in grocery prices this year meant that everyone would need to contribute, which was a strange proclamation considering how we'd always shared the burden as a family. It felt like someone had ripped the joy out of the room. Why did it feel like such a dire situation? I looked around, searching for supportive eyes or someone to break the tension. The shallow laughs only underscored the simmering discontent in my heart. Just as I started to relax, she passed around a collection bowl, glaring at me as if the responsibility to pay for Thanksgiving groceries rested solely on my shoulders. My mind raced, confusion clouding my thoughts. It isn't a potluck if you intend to charge your family to attend. The ambivalence unfolded further as she demanded we each pay an outrageous amount akin to what a meal would cost for a dozen people at a restaurant. I looked at my family's expectant faces. I felt trapped. My heart sank because I would have defended my point without hesitation had this not been my blood. So, I hesitated, caught between the horror of being labeled the cheap sibling and the truth of my situation that left me worrying about bills. Just as I opened my mouth to voice my feelings, a small voice from my youngest niece chimed in, asking why we couldn't all share the joy of spending time together instead of worrying about money. My heart squeezed painfully. I saw my sister's face go pale. I tried to shift the conversation, laughing nervously and sharing a silly story about being trapped in my cramped apartment, but it only felt like digging a deeper hole as my other siblings stared at me in disappointment. I could feel the energy of the room crashing and swirling around me. My pulse quickened, panic began to choke the air. I voiced a quiet AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. Trying to gauge the atmosphere. Unexpectedly, that innocent prompt lit up tension. "Well, maybe if we all pitched in like we used to, we wouldn't have this problem," my sister snapped, her smile long gone, replaced by a deep flush of anger. Before I could speak, the room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, voices tangled in a familial riot, accusations of selfishness, indifference, and entitlement scraping against each other like metal on metal. I recoiled, panic clawing its way up my throat as I desperately tried to understand how my innocent gesture had thrown everyone into chaos. I could have sworn I watched our family fracture in real time, the crushing realization that we had begun to care more about our pride than the warmth of our shared history drowning the last shreds of joy in the room. My niece started crying, and suddenly the world blurred around me. It felt like I was in a nightmare where nothing could be salvaged. I don't know how long I sat quietly afterwards as their voices echoed, part of me desperately wanting to bolt from that house, and yet another part wished to mend the fraying bonds of my family. I took a breath, willing to attempt a peace offering, only to have my sister shout that it wasn't about me, it was about the costs, almost as if she were trying to erase my existence from that evening. I watched as one sibling left in anger, the door slamming shut behind them, a hollow thud that lingered in the air and resonated deep within me. I can't recall how we finally settled down to the meal after that storm. Tension had wrapped itself around the uneaten turkey, the sides untouched, and we grappled through half-hearted cheers, the festive spirit sucked dry. After a painful pause, I left to the bathroom, desperately trying to breathe, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw were the guilt-laden eyes of the niece I had disappointed, an image that would haunt me long past that evening. I stepped back into the dining room, shifting on my feet, feeling like I had stumbled into a family gathering less than ideal, a space that felt less like home than an echo of what we used to be. The atmosphere stank of resentment. As I murmured a quiet goodbye later, guilt churned, reminding me of people I loved, staring at their half-eaten plates riddled with an anguish that would linger, ready to haunt me as the holidays loomed closer. My expectations, rather than bringing me into the fold, had created a rift that would deepen and darken into every Thanksgiving to follow. All that remained was the question, AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. And in the end, the answer was unfathomably clear: it cost more than money to keep a family together. I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from two kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed two distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you two doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode, after all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear. Beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that left me questioning my sanity and ultimately led me to this moment of confession. My cousin Jamie is 7, and he is, without a doubt, the most insufferable little monster I've ever encountered. From tantrums that could wake the dead to the way he crafts intricate lies just to see how far he can push the adults in his life, it's a miracle that he hasn't driven my poor aunt to the brink of madness. When my aunt asked me to babysit him for the weekend while she took on extra shifts at her job, a request that came with the guilt trip about how much she needed the money, I felt the flood of irritation rise within me. It wasn't just the idea of babysitting Jamie that made my skin crawl, it was the knowledge that he would spend the day trying to find creative ways to torture my patience. I remember the last time I babysat him, he told my aunt I had locked him in the bathroom for hours when I only stepped out to grab my phone from the kitchen, and she believed him without questioning a single word. Heart-pounding, the memory of his sweet, innocent smiling face as he recounted that fabricated tale to her on the phone replayed in my mind, and I snapped, AITA for refusing. I had meant to gently decline, but my frustration erupted, and I told her I couldn't babysit a lying brat and that Jamie didn't deserve my help. The silence on the line spoke more than 100 words, and I could almost hear her heart shatter through the phone. I hung up, instantly filled with regret and the gnawing dread of what my refusal might mean for her job. Uncharacteristically, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, but I convinced myself that it was for my own sanity. That night, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in my gut, as if I'd unknowingly invoked an ancient curse. It wasn't until the night of my refusal, just as I struggled to fall asleep, that I flicked off my lamp and was met with a whisper that slithered through the shadows of the room, the distinct sound of a child's laughter merging with the eerie creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I turned to face the darkened corner where the shadows projected odd shapes, and I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. Yet, when I shut my eyes again, I could still hear it, his laughter, soft and sinister. Over the next few nights, the laughter grew louder and more distorted, as if taunting me for my past refusal, and I began experiencing vivid nightmares of Jamie lurking just outside my bedroom door, a twisted grin stitched across his face, his eyes glimmering with malice that should have never existed in a child. These weren't ordinary nightmares but vivid reenactments of every terrible thing he had done to me, the time he convinced me to jump into a freezing pool so he could watch me flail, or when he deliberately spilled soda all over my homework and feigned ignorance. He was attempting to break through in some dark, demonic way. I started doubting my reality. Was Jamie truly a lying brat, or was there a different, more sinister entity taking control of him? The whole week passed in a haze, each night marked by a new scream echoing in my mind, and each day drained me further. My aunt was clearly worried. She texted me not only to reassure me about Jamie but promised she wouldn't leave him with me ever again. Still, every time I thought of Jamie, I saw the flicker of something dreadful behind his eyes, almost a hunger for chaos that made my heart flutter with dread. And just as I began entertaining the idea of going to my aunt to apologize, a storm rolled in, pounding against my windows like a frantic child desperate for attention, forcing me to confront my refusal once and for all. 4 nights in, I was yanked from a thick slumber by the sound of footsteps in my living room and a familiar cackle that sent icy dread pooling in my stomach. Tired, shaky, and on edge, I crept down the hallway, my heart thumping hard enough to overlay the sounds of thunder. As I rounded the corner, clutching my phone like a fast-acting spell against whatever overlap between dream and reality awaited me, I came face to face with Jamie, grinning, his small figure silhouetted by moonlight spilling through my window. Except this time, there was something off about him, a deep shadow hanging over his form, almost tethering him to the floor as if gravity itself hungered to keep him from escaping my view. "Can I come in?" His voice was sweet, yet sinister, a perfect harmony of the innocent tone wrapped around the darkness that slipped through the walls like smoke. I blinked, unsure how to respond, frozen in the threshold of my own home. Was this truly my cousin, or had the shadows taken his form? "Let me in," he urged again, the sweetness giving way to a disturbing insistence, and as I stood there, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was paralyzed as we locked eyes, and if I hadn't summoned the will to yank the door shut, someone, would have slipped inside. After that encounter, I very nearly convinced myself I was losing my grip on reality, my mind betraying me, robbing me of the line between imagination and truth. But every scream of laughter echoing through the dark only bolstered my conviction that I had come face to face with something wicked. Days turned into a blur of anxiety as I huddled away from the world, each corner I turned feeling haunted by the shadow of laughter that taunted me from just beyond reach. When I heard a faint knock at the door days later, I felt my blood run cold, and for once, I thought of checking to see who would be foolish enough to knock after everything, but the creeping dread rooted me in place. Then, a faint giggle burst through, and I knew it was Jamie. Memories of my aunt pleading with me to forgive him flashed, but deep down, I understood my refusal echoed through to this day, and I prayed the darkness would answer since I didn't dare look up at the door. Instead of opening up, I chose to remain haunted by the shadow of that constant laughter, and in a twisted reality I had only begun to comprehend. I waited, driven out of necessity to understand that some monsters are very real and don't exist merely in stories. I chose to ignore that knock, hoping to bury my guilt in silence, but what would I do now when, no matter where I turned, the sound of Jamie's laughter remained a reminder of the child I once knew who now belonged to the dark? I never thought my wedding would end in chaos, but when my cousin Lisa showed up in a blood-red gown that clashed with the white theme of my ceremony, it felt like I'd walked into a horror movie instead of my dream day. I had been preparing for this moment for months, pouring my heart and soul into every detail, from the flowers to the music, all meticulously designed to evoke the purest enchantment, while I floated down the aisle in the lace gown I had envisioned since childhood, the embodiment of everything I had ever wanted. I remember the moment I spotted Lisa, standing smugly in the doorway of the venue with that gaudy dress that mirrored the sinister beauty of a vampire in some cheap film. I felt the air chill around me, my stomach twisting with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Didn't she know this day wasn't about her? The whispers of my friends buzzed in my ears, murmurs of disdain that fed my fury as I approached her, my carefully cultivated smile now plastered on my face like a mask. "Lisa, why are you here?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, knowing the photographer was capturing every moment. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise," she replied, her tone dripping with faux innocence. At that moment, I remembered every family gathering where Lisa had overshadowed me, every snide comment she had made that belittled my choices, and I resolved that today would be different. My heart raced as I glanced back at my fiancé, who had excused himself to handle a family emergency but had assured me moments before that he couldn't wait to see me in my dress. Deep down, I didn't want to cause a scene, but her presence felt threatening, malignant, like she was festering in the happy blooms of this day, ready to checkmate me. As I took a step closer, Lisa's eyes flashed with that familiar defiance that prickled the nape of my neck. "What's your issue?" "It's just a color," she responded, feigning ignorance, but the challenge in her voice stoked the fire brewing inside me. "It's not just a color, it's a wedding." I shot back, my fury bubbling to the surface as I wrestled with the decision weighing on my conscience. A part of me was screaming to turn back, to let it slide and just enjoy the day, but another part clung to the bubbling rage, a sense of justice that demanded action. "Leave. Now," I spat, my fingers trembling as I clenched them into fists. The guests' eyes locked onto us, an audience drawn into an unfolding drama that felt vividly alive as whispers rippled through the crowd, but rather than fear, I felt a surge of adrenaline at reclaiming my day, my moment. Lisa's facade cracked, anger bubbling up beneath her flawless skin as she opened her mouth to retort, but all I could think about was how tired I was of being walked over, tired of being the unobtrusive cousin, the forever witness to her eclipses, tired of everything that had been unsaid over the years. "You're making a mistake. This is ridiculous. You're ruining your own wedding. Over something so petty," she shouted, her voice cutting through the whispers, drawing me closer to confrontation. I could see the shock on the faces of a few of my aunts, the mixture of gasps and raised eyebrows filling the room with anticipation, but I had crossed the threshold, I couldn't stop now. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I turned my back on her, striding toward the wedding coordinator, whose eyes widened in disbelief and then mirrored my determination. "Security, please," I commanded, my heart drumming like a war cry as I heard Lisa hiss behind me, the noise echoing with the venom of a snake cornered, but I pressed on. I knew what having her there meant. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about the years of her putting me in the shadows. Moments later, two burly men approached, their expressions neutral yet ready, and when they were instructed to escort Lisa out, the look of hurt and fury painted her face as she went limp, her shock overwhelming her defiance. "You'll regret this," she spat as she was guided out, each word a dart aimed at my heart, as I stood there, shaking but finally feeling light, the burden of her specter lifted from my shoulders, the weight of my family's toxicity unfurling in the dust behind her. The ceremony resumed, but I could feel the eyes of my relatives boring into my back, the murmurs of disapproval hanging in the air thick as fog, and I couldn't tell if they were aggrieved by my actions or secretly relieved to be rid of the drama Lisa seemed to constantly bring. My heart sank as I realized what I'd done. The moment of triumph had morphed into a shadow of regret, the whispers of bridezilla and family tension stirring uncontrollably around me like a whirlwind of judgmental stares. As the vows were exchanged and I glanced around, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wouldn't take this lightly, especially with her threatening words hanging heavy in the air. After the ceremony, as the reception blossomed around me in joyful chaos, laughter, dancing, and so many smiles, my joy felt marred by the creeping shadow of guilt. Could I really celebrate a day that, in some way, felt marred by the act of banishment? I tried to brush away the thoughts, focusing instead on the love swelling in my chest for my husband and the genuine moments shared with our friends, but Lisa's presence loomed heavily in my mind like a specter waiting to strike. Days turned into weeks, and just as I thought I could forget about the wedding drama, my phone buzzed late one night, draining the color from my face. It was a group text from my family. My heart raced as I opened it to find a picture of Lisa in that hideous, blood-red gown, with the caption, "Some weddings should be cancelled." My stomach dropped like a stone as her slander spread through our family like wildfire. The rising tide of animosity was making its way toward me, wrapping around my throat, threatening to suffocate the joy I had fought for. Each Sunday dinner became an arena of cold silence, excluding me from family conversations as I was framed as the villain, and while I was initially defensive, the weight of isolation left me gasping. The day finally came when I was invited to a family gathering with an air of dread. As I stepped through the front door, I could practically feel the judgment dripping from the ceiling fixtures. I quietly made my way to the living room, my heart thundering loudly against my ribcage as I caught sight of Lisa, clad in white this time, sitting smugly at the center of the table like some dark queen surveying her territory. The tension gripped me like an iron fist, clenching my heart as unwelcome memories spiraled back. Her smirk twisted with cruelty was overwhelming, laying bare the extent of her hunger for vengeance. I stood frozen in place, contemplating my next move when Lisa's eyes met mine with a glint of sadistic glee, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "Oh look, the bride graces us with her presence. Didn't you know weddings are supposed to be about everyone?" she quipped, laughter bubbling around her like a toxic potion, and just like that, the room shifted, murmurs erupting anew as I felt their eyes darting with interest between us. Her words were daggers, driving my insecurities deeper, igniting an inferno of rage within me, but instead of striking back as I longed to, all I could muster was a weak smile. "I'm glad to see you, too, Lisa," I managed to reply, forcing the words to escape, every syllable leaving a bitter taste in my mouth while her laughter washed over me like a tide, depending on the whispers of my family to feed her power. As the evening wore on, I noticed that my cousin didn't relent, sowing discord with poisoned words, planting unease in the hearts of my loved ones that grew more potent with every sip of wine. When I left that night, I felt the confines of my own family closing in, shadows whispering ever so softly, was I really the villain? But the truth was, standing at the edge of that wedding day, I had fought for myself in a world that always sidelined me, and even if the consequences were grave, I couldn't say I didn't deserve my moment of victory, however fleeting. So, AITA for having my cousin thrown out of my wedding? I don't know yet, but as I drive away, the question trembles in my mind: what kind of family comes together by building their foundation on the bones of betrayal? Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around?" The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. "Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around." The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. "You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him." My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind. But by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. "Dad, you need to." Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. "You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here," he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. "Leave him alone," I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. "She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer," he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. "You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. "Dad," I began slowly, "we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered." The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. "You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you." My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. "Enough," Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. "You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been." With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. "Let's leave together," I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. "You can't save him from the truth," Walter whispered, "he will always be with me. No more." I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. No, we can build a future together. The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. "It's him, isn't it?" I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. "He's coming back for us." The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. "You're not going back there," I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach.
It was a night I'll never forget, with a man I'll probably never see again. A night shrouded in the kind of darkness that swallowed the flickers of my small-town streetlights, as if the universe itself conspired to keep the sky a suffocating black. I had just moved back home after college, tired, anxious, and still reeling from the pressure of deadlines that never seemed to end, and I decided to walk to the only convenience store that stayed open late, just to grab a pack of smokes. The air was pregnant with the scent of rain as it threatened to fall, and the muffled echoes of distant thunder churned from somewhere deep in the oppressive clouds. It was after 11 when I reached the store, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow that felt so out of place against the wildness of the surrounding night. I could tell the cashier was just as bored as I felt, scrolling through his phone with a vacant expression. I snagged my smokes and, as I stepped out into the cool night air, I noticed a figure leaning against the brick wall beside the store, a man whose presence sent an odd shiver along my spine. He wore a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light, and his face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. For a fleeting moment, I considered turning back and heading home, but something about his demeanor intrigued me. He seemed to radiate an almost magnetic pull, like a moth to a flame, and so, against my better judgment, I approached him. "You look lost," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like dried leaves skimming over asphalt. I laughed uneasily, not quite sure how to respond, and when I glanced up to meet his gaze, the intensity of his eyes unsettled me. They were a vibrant, unnatural shade of blue, almost too bright for the darkness that cloaked him, and I felt an involuntary chill as he fixed me with that penetrating stare. I was startled when he, without any prompt, began telling me a story about a cursed forest that swallowed anyone who dared enter beyond dusk, how its trees whispered secrets to those unlucky enough to wander too close. The rain began to fall then, a soft patter that turned into a downpour, and we huddled beneath the store's awning as he painted chilling images with words that drew me in deeper, each tale punctuated with an eerie detail that dragged me further from reality. He spoke of a man who had lost his way, who had ventured into that dark place and emerged changed. "You see, some places don't just hold shadows, they hold memories," he said, his gaze unwavering. The allure of his storytelling made the world around us fade, and I found myself hanging on his every word, even as pure dread started creeping into my bones. As he spoke of lost souls and anguish, the atmosphere thickened, and I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows of the alleyway behind him, an elongation, a flicker of movement that felt almost sentient. "You should be careful where you tread, especially when the night calls out to you," the man said, a smile playing upon his lips, and it sent another ripple of unease coursing through me. I wanted to turn back home, to leave whatever strange magic had woven itself around this moment, but I found myself indulging his eerie tales, entangled in the fear he was weaving. Hours slipped by like the minutiae of time had melted. Gripped by fascination, I learned about his own dark encounters. He spoke like a prophet, like someone who had danced too closely to the fire and bore the scars of his own mistakes. The weight of his stories clung to me, his every word a thread tying me to the unfolding panic, and before I knew it, I was sharing my own fears, my own vulnerabilities, what brought me back to this town, the crushing loneliness that pressed upon my chest. He listened, nodding in an understanding nothing could prepare me for. Then, just as quickly as the atmosphere thickened, the rain suddenly subsided, and an uncomfortable silence enveloped us, pregnant with expectancy. I looked at him then, expecting to see that unsettling smile, but instead his eyes shifted to something behind me, a flicker of concern sparking across his features. "You should go," he said, his tone startlingly serious. "You're not safe here." I glanced around, a visceral need to flee taking root as my heart raced. In that moment, I felt it, something lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow, something watching from the depths of the shadows, and with its presence came an unbearable dread that sent me scrambling away. I whipped around toward my distant home, the streets now a labyrinthine stretch of anxiety as I raced to escape this night that had started so innocently. My breath came in gasps, and I could still feel that man's gaze boring into me, urging me onward, but as I reached the edge of my neighborhood, I paused, my heart collapsing in confusion. I turned back, searching for him, but the corner where he had stood was now empty, swallowed by the thick black that gripped the night sky. That lingering sense of dread remained, stretching beyond the confines of the evening until it settled into my bones, but try as I might, I could never shake that feeling that whatever dark force had prowled at the periphery of my existence was waiting for the moment to embrace me fully. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me and locking every bolt, my chest heaving as I attempted to process the madness of it all. For weeks after that ghastly encounter, I tried to dismiss it as a bizarre night in a small town, but I couldn't shake the urgency in the man's voice or the sensation of being watched that followed me everywhere. The locals surely thought I was crazy when I started asking about him, but no one knew who I was speaking of. It was as if he had never existed. Then, a few weeks later, in a fit of recklessness, I decided to visit that cursed forest he spoke of, the temptation of the unknown gnawing at my sanity, seeking clarification of the fear that had gripped me. I went deeper into those woods, embraced by shadows that felt alive, and a realization washed over me: the night had come alive, and in its chill, I felt a pull, one so powerful it was as if the shadows themselves reached out for me. I wandered farther than I ever planned to, drawn to whispers that teased me from the depths of the trees. I don't remember how long I was there before I noticed the trees closing in, encircling me in a claustrophobic embrace. It was then that I finally understood the true horror of that night, the man's warning, and the terrors that lurked beyond. I felt something cold and malevolent wrap around my ankle, pulling me down, deeper into a place where shadows held all the answers, and I screamed, my voice lost to the night, a soul swallowed whole, a night I'd never forget with a man I would never see again, for I was now part of his tales, helpless against the remnants of darkness and despair entwined within those cursed woods.
I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. "What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings," I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, "I couldn't care less about you." I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. One minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "You should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me, every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out.
I don't always come home from work straight away. I pull over somewhere and chill for an hour or so. It started as a harmless habit, a way to decompress after an exhausting day at the call center, where the sound of my voice droning through endless customer complaints blurred my sense of self. I found this rundown park on the outskirts of town that nobody seemed to visit, an oasis of disconnection. With its crooked picnic tables and the hollow echo of silence, it became my refuge. At first, I'd play solitaire on my phone or scroll aimlessly through social media, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park descended into a veil of shadow, I began to notice the transformations of the landscape around me. One evening, as I kicked pebbles on the path, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure in a faded brown hoodie, its face obscured, stood by the edge of the woods. I waved, half-heartedly expecting them to retreat into the thicket, but they merely stared, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. Rather than panic, a strange sense of calm enveloped me, as if they were a part of the scenery, another shade of night creeping into my world. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, that I'd simply imagined the whole encounter from spending too much time alone. But after that, every time I parked at the old lot, I felt a pulse of energy in the air, a whisper of unseen eyes watching me from behind the trees. The figure returned again, always motionless, always just out of reach. I learned their routine. On Tuesdays, they'd be there just as the sun vanished, and on Thursdays, they'd be gone before I settled into my usual spot. I started rearranging my schedule, choosing to leave work late, my heart racing with anticipation when I finally saw them, little more than a shadow, yet almost magnetic in their stillness. I began to stay longer, often pushing past the hour mark, drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the urge to understand what this specter wanted from me. But as the weeks crept on, dread seeped into my fascination. One chilly evening, the figure approached the car, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly okay with the distance that loomed between us. Their hoodie hung loosely, hiding all but the faint outline of their body. My heart thumped. I contemplated leaving, revving my engine, but my curiosity swelled into something louder, compelling me to stay. I rolled down my window, hesitating like a fool, and asked, "Who are you?" The figure simply cocked its head, and in that moment, I could almost feel the trees lean in, as if they were waiting for the answer just as much as I was. They drew closer, the rustling leaves around them amplifying a tension I couldn't quite escape, and finally spoke. "You leave them every night, don't you?" The words sliced through the crisp air, chilling me to the bone. I stammered, grappling with the unexpected emotion that washed over me, an unsettling mix of recognition and fear. "No, I don't," I protested. But the figure merely smiled, though I could not see their lips move beneath the fabric of the hoodie. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I didn't understand, yet I felt strings pulling, colors swirling in my mind as if fate had rewinded a terrible secret from my past, something I'd tossed in a box deep within my mind. As if my insides churned, the memories streamed in, late phone calls, neglected promises, and unmade decisions that had haunted me ever since my brother vanished without a trace 5 years ago. My throat tightened, breath caught in a web of regret as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes wide, seeking clarity in the dim light cast by my headlights. That night, I drove home feeling heavy, yet light, like I'd peeled a layer of myself off. The figure hadn't been a stranger but a haunting memory shaped like a person, a catalyst for the guilt I bore in silence. I tried to shake the sensation, but it crept back, a relentless specter in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and every time I parked at the lot, the figure seemed to glide between my thoughts and the reality outside my window. They became a linkage to the sense of hope I had lost somewhere in my brother's absence. On the occasions when I neglected to visit the park and rushed home, I could almost feel their expectant gaze on my back, coaxing me to return, to confront what I was running from. My co-workers began noticing my changing demeanor, whispers of concern circling their conversations, but I brushed them off, convincing myself I was fine, that this was just a way to reclaim a portion of myself lost to grief. One particularly frigid night, after a hellish shift, I felt a summons nearly magnetic, driving me to the park with a purpose that I could no longer deny. My heart pounded in anticipation as I parked in that familiar space, the darkness wrapping around me like an embrace. The figures stood where they always did, but this time, there was an air of finality in their stillness. I could sense the weight of every unconfessed secret and the echoed memories of loss and guilt tingling against my skin. I climbed out of my car, the air was thick, my breath hanging in the night, and for the first time, I whispered as if speaking to the darkness itself, "I'm sorry." The figure stepped closer, their silhouette melding with the night until all I could see were their eyes, reflecting the last remnants of daylight. Without a word, they reached behind them and handed me a small, weather-worn object, a keychain, twisted and contorted, that felt oddly warm in my palm. The familiarity ignited the flame of memories, it had been my brother's. Rage and sorrow bubbled within me, the unquenchable need for closure spiraling. I looked up, demanding understanding, but all I saw was a fleeting silhouette being swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I gasped, a hollowness pooling in my chest, as I staggered back to my car, the keychain clutched tightly in my hand. Driving home that night, I didn't know if I freed a piece of my past or if the figure was a reflection of what I still had to confront. The park visits became less frequent, burdened with meaning and unwilling to offer solace like before. Yet, every now and then, as the lonely streetlights flickered past my window, I could see them standing at the edge of the woods on a Tuesday or Thursday. I learned then that the specters we try to avoid often find us in the corners of our minds, waiting to be acknowledged. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat on my couch, that keychain still in my pocket, reflecting on everything I had left unspoken, and felt a pull to those forgotten hours at the park. I could almost hear the rustling whispers beckoning me to return, to sit in silence as darkness enveloped the world outside. No longer did I see the figure as a ghoul of my past but as a guide to my future. So I drove back to the park, ready to face my haunting. When I pulled up, my breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't there. I felt disoriented, as if I had stumbled into an alternate reality I never knew existed. I opened the car door, stepping onto the grounds rendered barren and brightened by strange lights that flickered just beyond the trees, inviting me closer with their pulse. There, a previous absence in the shadows revealed something far worse. The park pulsed as if it were alive, and I was not alone after all. I took a trembling step forward, the keychain in my pocket heating, an urgency blossoming within me, pulling me toward the heart of the park where the lights beckoned, a truth waiting to engulf me whole. I could feel the figure born from the shadows begin to stretch and weave around me, watching silently, the night alive with stories untold. I always thought of myself as a fairly rational person, someone grounded in reality, until the day my therapist made me realize something devastating, something I can no longer ignore. It started like any other session in his sparsely decorated office, a two-sentence summary of my week, followed by the customary shuffling of papers as he leaned forward, his auburn hair catching the dull glow from the overhead light. "You say you see shadows throughout your day, but always in peripheral vision. Why do you think that is?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. I shrugged it off, attributing my restless nights and nagging anxiety to mundane stressors, work, family, the usual suspects. But then he leaned back, searched my eyes deeply, and with a stone-cold expression, asked something that chilled me, "Have you considered they might be trying to show you something?" That's when it hit me, the echoes of old memories I thought I had buried didn't just resurface, they morphed into something far darker. I began recalling moments that sent shivers up my spine, like the first time I felt a shadow flicker behind me while washing dishes, the second time I spotted a fleeting silhouette in an empty alley late at night. They were always there, lurking when I was alone, and I had become adept at ignoring them, convincing myself that anxiety had heightened my senses. What if they're not a figment of your imagination? He pondered, and with that question, I felt a seed of dread germinate inside me. Over the next few weeks, I became hyper-aware, purposely hoping to catch a glimpse of those shadows. It was as if my mind had opened a door that should have remained locked, revealing too much. I started to see vague outlines more clearly, shapes that morphed into familiar figures, my grandmother who had passed away when I was a child, a childhood friend who I lost to a tragic accident, all reaching out, but never quite touching me. My therapist encouraged me to face them, to understand why they were drawn to me. So, driven by a cocktail of fear and an insatiable thirst for truth, I began experimenting. I'd sit in the darkest corner of my house and wait, whispering apologies to those I had lost, hoping for an answer. It was exhilarating at first, the thrill of the unknown, similar to opening a long-forgotten book filled with untold stories. But as the weeks grew darker and the shadows pressed closer, my excitement soured into despair. Then one evening, I was sitting in my dimly lit living room, convinced I was completely alone, when I felt an oppressive wave of despair hit me. I turned off my phone, hoping to embrace the silence, and as I sat there, I instinctively glanced at the hallway. A dark form emerged, moving fluidly like smoke being blown by the wind, and my heart raced as its shape solidified before my eyes, a figure that looked hauntingly like my sister, who had vanished a decade ago. Her hair was tousled as if she had just woken up, and her eyes held a mix of sorrow and anger, a tempest of unspoken words brewing behind them. I reached out, longing to connect, to hear what she wanted to say, but she faded instantaneously, evaporating into thin air as my tears flooded my vision. I was a shaken wreck by the next therapy session. I screamed at my therapist that I couldn't take it anymore, that I was haunted by the past, the shadows I thought were benign were ghosts of my guilt. He sat quietly, analyzing me as though a conversation about my mental state were simply a puzzle he needed to solve. You think these shadows resemble those you cared about, but I think, in fact, they represent those whose absence still ties you to the past. You haven't mourned them properly, he replied, each word cutting deeper than a knife. I should have been angry, but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of loss, realizing that the shadows weren't merely manifestations of my guilt or memory, they were unresolved grief circling like vultures, reminding me of the pain I never addressed. As the days trudged on, I recognized these shadows infiltrating my dreams, playing scenes I hadn't been strong enough to face. I watched helplessly as my sister, my childhood friend, and even my grandparents replayed the last moments we spent together, distorted and stretched, always fading out as dread clutched me tighter. Therapy sessions turned into nightly marathons of anxiety, and fatigue seeped into my bones. I took sick leave from work, isolating myself from the world as the shadows suffocated me. Then one night, there was a forced clarity amid the chaos. I had a vivid dream where I found my sister, and she was holding a mirror. "Look at yourself," she said, her voice echoing like a siren's call. I hesitated but eventually gazed into it. Reflected back at me was not just my face, but the younger versions of my lost loved ones, faces twisted in agony, as though imploring me to understand. As I was swept away by the dark waters of guilt, I felt an unbreakable squeeze, forcing me to wake up gasping for air, and suddenly it all came crashing down. I realized that my shadows were neither benign nor mere echoes of the past, they were figments of my unacknowledged pain, filling my life with a sorrow rooted in unresolved grief. I understood what I needed to do. The next week, I returned to my therapist with a fierce determination, pouring out my heart and soul, recounting the dreams, the shadows, and the reflections that had come to haunt me. I subbed in his office, confronting a decade of pain, the losses still shackled to my heart. He nodded knowingly, guiding me through the first steps of reconciliation with those I had lost. It didn't happen overnight, it was a process that took weeks, but bit by bit, I began addressing my grief properly. I spoke to my sister in those dark corners, apologized profusely, and slowly, the shadows began to shift, their edges becoming less distinct, their presence less oppressive. But just when I thought I was on the road to healing, a terrifying realization struck me. What if these shadows weren't just ephemeral remnants from the past? What if they were slipping into my life for a darker purpose? My next appointment with my therapist was when I told him. He listened carefully and sat back, looking more pensive than ever. "Have you noticed they come to comfort you, but the moment you reach out, they're gone?" he asked, and dread settled in my chest as his words resonated with the truth I had been avoiding. The deeper my healing ran, the more I felt detached from these shadows. They wanted to keep me tethered. Without them, I feared I would be utterly alone. I left that session rattled, unable to shake the unsettling thought from my mind, wandering through my days where fear morphed into paranoia, What if letting go of the past meant letting go of the one last connection with them? That dread gnawed me with every passing day, until my unceasing dread morphed into full-blown panic when I realized something immense: I couldn't feel their presence anymore. They were fading, and with that, I found myself standing once more in my living room, the shadows conspicuously absent, grasping for any hint of familiarity. I called for my sister, whispered for my childhood friend, but my pleas echoed back in haunting silence. It was as if I were standing on hollow ground, resting on a precipice between life and death, desperately concluding what my heart could no longer bear. A chilling realization sank into my bones, chilling me to the core, and I understood the devastating truth my therapist had laid bare: they had not come to haunt me, they had come to protect me from noticing that I was truly, hopelessly alone. It was a muggy Wednesday evening when I found it, tucked under a twisted patch of weeds near a lamppost, a neat, tightly bound stack of cash, crisp and untouched, totaling $800. My heart raced with exhilaration and guilt. What were the odds of encountering such a fortune just lying there? I looked around, half expecting someone to rush back for it, but the street was empty, save for a few stray cats scavenging the darkening alleyway. Lured by the promise of a small fortune and a fleeting belief that maybe, just maybe, this was some cosmic karma for my endless run of bad luck, I pocketed the money and hurried home, my mind racing through fantasies, new clothes, a weekend getaway. But when the euphoric thrill subsided, an unsettling thought began to creep in. Who had lost this money, and why was it just sitting there? I pushed it aside, convinced it was my stroke of luck. That night, I fell asleep thinking I had scored, dreaming of countless possibilities, yet, the dreams twisted darker as the hours wore on. I woke up to find my room flooded with moonlight, shadows danced along the walls, and an unnerving sense of dread pooled in my gut, a feeling that I had crossed a line. Shaking it off, I spent the cash over the next few days, indulging in new sneakers, dinners out, and a vintage vinyl collection I'd coveted for ages, all the while ignoring the gnawing sensation like I was being watched. Then, on the third night after my little spree, a soft knock echoed from my front door, pulling me from sleep. Heart pounding in my chest, I peered through the peephole, but there was only darkness on the other side. I hesitated before finally opening it, and there was nothing. I rationalized it must have been the house settling, yet as I climbed back into bed, an unsettling chill ran through me. Nights turned into restless fever dreams, where shadows lurked, and I could hear whispers drifting through the walls as if the house itself carried secrets. I decided to go on a weekend camping trip to clear my head, hoping fresh air would wash away the anxiety, but instead, my unease morphed into paranoia. I kept feeling someone tailing me back to my tent, shadows flitting just beyond the glow of the campfire. On the night of my return, I found a note slipped under my door, a single line: "You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours." Panic consumed me. I ripped it from the floor and scoured my apartment for hidden cameras or surveillance equipment, but nothing was amiss. I thought of going to the police, but part of me was terrified they'd see me as a thief. The feeling of dread clawed at me, and my dreams became nightmares of strangers with hollowed eyes and grins that shifted unnaturally. One evening, wrapped in my own self-imposed isolation, I decided to return to that lamppost where it all began, a futile act of atonement, an absurd gesture against an invisible foe. The street was eerily quiet, moonlight illuminating the cracked pavement, but when I reached that spot, my heart sank. The area was now barren, as if the ground itself had decided to swallow whatever remained of that hidden treasure. Suddenly, an icy breeze whipped around me, and from the shadows, I saw a figure emerge, stretched limbs, a pale face, and eyes that burned with a bright, unnatural light, locking onto mine with a grip of unimaginable terror, and it spoke in a voice laced with rage: "You took what was mine." I stumbled back, stumbling over my own feet as the realization hit me: this was no mere stalker or oppressor, it was something far worse, a spirit of vengeance awakened by my greed. I ran, my heart slamming against my ribs, but no matter how fast I sprinted, I could feel it gaining on me, colder air brushing against my neck like icy fingers. I burst into my home, slamming the door behind me, but the moment my back hit the wood, the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. In that suffocating void, I could hear the soft thud of footsteps. "You're never alone," they seemed to whisper, and suddenly I realized those whispers weren't in my head, they echoed from beyond the walls, from the very depths of the house, spiraling around me like a distant echo of their grief. I ran for my phone to call for help, but as soon as I picked it up, a bone-chilling growl erupted from the corners of my apartment, making me drop it to the floor. The air turned thick with an angry energy, and out of desperation, I screamed, "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Please, just leave me alone." Silence fell like a crushing weight, but the peace didn't last long. The lights burst back on, revealing my living room immersed in shadows stretching and writhing on the walls, and as I turned, there it was again. That wretched figure, now standing right behind me, a sinister smile splitting across its face. "It's too late for apologies. You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours," it hissed, its breath cold as winter frost, and I felt my heart shatter. In an instant, the world faded to black, and when I opened my eyes, I was right back at that lamppost, but this time, I was staring down at my own lifeless form sprawled on the cracked pavement, as another wretch like me moved to gather the cash scattered beside my body. And in that moment, I understood, the cash was never meant for me, it was a curse, an anchor to drag the greedy into the abyss, and as my hollowed eyes looked back at the living world, I realized I was doomed to wander these silent streets, watching one unfortunate soul after another pick up that cursed money and spark the cycle of misery all over again. I never believed in the normal concept of good and evil. To me, they were just perceptions shaped by our experiences, until I stumbled onto a dark truth about myself that I should have ignored. It all began one mundane evening when I was scrolling through an online forum, where a group of people discussed how they had received prime access to something akin to an ethereal black market. They spoke of a subscription service where dreams could be bought and sold like commodities. I dismissed it as mere fantasy until, out of sheer curiosity and boredom, I joined. I felt an irresistible pull towards a listing titled "The Life You Deserve," and the seller promised an existence where I could embody my deepest desires, no strings attached, just a simple transaction of your memories, beliefs, and reality. The moment I clicked accept and input my bank info, I felt the proverbial spark igniting inside me, a surge of something between excitement and trepidation. I was stepping into a pact I believed I could control. The night arrived when the deal was to be sealed, and as I fell into a restless sleep, I vaguely remembered hearing the seller's voice whisper through the void, "Welcome to the experience of your life." What followed was an otherworldly journey. I woke up the next day feeling better than I ever had, equipped with charm and charisma, and radiating a confidence I never thought possible. People flocked to me as if I were a magnet, promotions piled up, friends multiplied, and I seemed to be living a charmed existence. But lurking beneath the surface, the initial euphoria transformed into an insatiable hunger. I discovered that with each fleeting moment basked in success, I became addicted to this newfound power over my own narrative. As I savored the highs, I started to notice the threads of my old life unraveling, the messages from friends I barely had time for, the frantic calls from my family who snapped at my absence, and the mounting silence that filled the spaces where laughter used to echo. Ignoring the signals, I pressed on, diving deeper into this allure that had become all-consuming until one fateful evening when the facade began to crack. Alone in my apartment, I swiped through my phone, observing a world where everyone I once cared about had grown distant, their lives had moved on without me, while I remained perpetually glued to this narcissistic splendor. Then came the day of reckoning when I returned home late, exhausted from exerting every ounce of my new charisma. As I flipped on the light switch, I was hit with a sense of dread. My apartment, once filled with warmth, felt cold and uninviting, an empty shell. But that wasn't all, there was something else. My belongings had subtly changed, altered slightly to reflect aspects of me that didn't sit right. The dining table, once cluttered with old magazines and memories, was entirely bare, save for a picture frame holding a photo of me that looked almost alien, devoid of emotion, with hollow eyes that seemed to gaze right into my soul. Panic gripped me, and I quickly scoured the internet for the seller, feeling that I had been tricked, and desperately typed in "The Life You Deserve" only to find the page wiped clean. A digital ghost that left no trace behind. In that moment, a sense of clarity washed over me. I had achieved everything I had yearned for, but at what cost? I was haunted by the husks of connections I had discarded willingly in pursuit of hollow victories. I had become a specter, a mere shadow of my former self completely eclipsed by ambition. As days turned into weeks, I fought the growing void inside, engaging in desperate attempts to reconnect with my memories, but the harder I tried, the clearer it became that there was no going back. I could feel the pieces of my existence drifting further away from me like leaves caught on a merciless breeze. The profound loneliness morphed into panic. I couldn't function without the constant external validation. I found myself pacing the apartment, muttering to shadowed corners, desperate to recapture that warmth, when I noticed, quite suddenly, a figure standing beyond the sheer curtain of my window. I rushed to the glass, heart racing, but all I saw was the darkness of night, distorted silhouettes flickering in and out with the streetlights. I thought I'd lost my mind until I caught sight of a reflection looming behind me, a face I recognized but couldn't place, My own twisted image wearing my old self like a mask, deep lines carving despair around its eyes that shone with a sinister light. That's when I realized everything I had gained was merely temporary, a cheap substitute for the path I abandoned, leaving me stuck between but never wholly ensconced in either life. I felt the weight of regret like a blade buried deep within me. I had traded everything of value for glimmering illusions. It dawned on me that while I had grown from a shadowy introvert to a gilded socialite, I had forfeited the essence of what made me human, the messiness of relationships, the comfort of vulnerability, and the irreplaceable bonds of family and friends. Desperation clawed at my throat as I attempted to fabricate new memories that might heal the fractures, but the feel of genuine laughter, of shared moments, slipped further from my grasp. One night, under a moon obscured by clouds, the reality of everything imploded, and I sank to my knees in my bare living room as an audible crackling echoed, a sound not unlike the shattering of glass, and before I could comprehend what was happening, I was pulled into that dark expanse, a chasm of my own making. The whispers returned, haunting reminders that this was my reckoning. A shadowy vortex opened up before me, a sinister marketplace where voices melded into a chorus that echoed my name over and over, and amidst the frenzy surroundings, I saw it, the offering. My original life, nestled like a precious trinket amongst all things valuable I had redeemed, in exchange for my true self. It was a vision I had forgotten, filled with laughter, warmth, and vibrant connections that once painted my world in brilliant colors. But the catch was clear: reclaiming that life meant I would forfeit my newfound power, becoming an ordinary ghost of my former self, a choice I was loath to make. In that moment of indecision, I felt time bending, collapsing, everything I had achieved swirling around me in an inescapable storm of consequence, leading me face to face with my past. I knew I should have walked away, I should have resisted the allure of what I was never meant to possess because ultimately, that world was ephemeral, leaving me hollow and lost. In a desperate bid to reclaim what I had left behind, I reached out, grasping for a thread woven into the tapestry of my existence, the warmth of my family, the laughter of friends, the little moments of failure that once shaped me. As my fingers brushed against the vision, everything came crashing down, and I awoke the next morning back in my old life, pocked with scars but remarkably intact. Yet, even as dawn broke, I couldn't shake the feeling. My world had fallen apart because of my insatiable hunger, revealing a truth darker than I ever imagined. I had chosen to run towards something I thought I wanted, unaware that sometimes, what you really seek is buried deep within the life you already possess.
Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escaped those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline?
When I received the invitation to the pool party from Sasha, a social media influencer known for her extravagant gatherings, I felt a rush of excitement alongside the inevitable twinge of doubt. I didn't really know her, though we shared a few mutual friends, and I imagined we'd be sipping cocktails by the glimmering water, surrounded by laughter and music. The day of the party, I donned my best swimsuit, something vibrant enough to catch an eye but simple enough to blend in, as I arrived at her sprawling suburban mansion, where the twinkling lights hung from the palm trees like whimsical stars, casting a warm glow on a crowd buzzing with chatter. As I stepped onto the patio, I was met by the smell of sunscreen mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, an earthy, almost sour aroma that set my nerves on edge as the laughter picked up and a faint sound of splashing echoed from the pool, but I shrugged it off, diving into the mingling and pretending I belonged. About an hour in, my stomach twisted in a sudden wave of nausea. I thought maybe it was the shrimp cocktail I'd indulged in a bit too eagerly, so I excused myself to the bathroom, desperately hoping to alleviate the discomfort. It was then I noticed the sign above the toilet, "Please do not flush anything but toilet paper," and I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease in the pit of my stomach as I obeyed the rules, wary of what anything might mean in a home where guests clearly followed no discernible hygiene standards. The insipid laughter outside morphed into a cacophony of whoops and yells as some guests engaged in drunken pool games, but a sickly sweet smell wafted in from the open window, making me recoil. I couldn't pinpoint the scent, but it felt wrong. almost like my instincts were screaming at me to get out. When I rejoined the party, I'd hoped my discomfort would fade, but more and more, I noticed the guests reaching for the buffet and barely managing a smile as they tucked into molded cakes and charred hot dogs, their faces warped slightly as laughter rang out, but behind their eyes was a glimmer of something darker, a shared secret that whispered from one guest to the next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the laughter fading into something with sharper edges, when I caught a group of girls crowded around Sasha, pointing, their giggles morphing into wild shrieks of delight that were somehow vicious. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I leaned in, desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever had caught their interest. Alas, the sight left me paralyzed. Floating grotesquely in the pool, unnoticed by the oblivious revelers, was a murky swirl, a mass of putrid brown, trailing like a vile ribbon through the water. Panic gripped me, and I took a step back. Did they notice? Didn't they see it? I whispered to myself while trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but every time I stole a glance, the horrid mass grew larger, its revolting viscosity undulating, taunting me as I felt bile rise in my throat. Suddenly, as if commanded by an unseen force, a few partygoers lured Sasha into the pool, and as they splashed about, their laughter turned into wild shrieks as the surface of the water erupted. The mass began to break apart, horrifyingly, and without any warning, a soft cloud of odor billowed up, wrapping around those careless partygoers, forcing them to stop in their tracks. What happened next was indescribable. It was a slow-motion moment where realization dawned, reflected in each face that had once been joyful, eyes going wide in horror as they recoiled from the foul stench now filling the air and churning the festal atmosphere into something terrifying as they splashed and scrambled blindly out of the water. But instead of panic audible, their laughter returned falsely, layered with manic joy as they realized what lay just beneath the surface. Screams erupted as more of the guests caught wind of the pungent reality about what had just emerged from the depths of the pool, the sound borderline ecstatic with a touch of primal fear. Sasha, however, didn't seem to mind. If anything, it seemed to fuel her wildness, because in her gleeful dance around the pool, she beckoned others to join, and that was when I caught a glimpse of something even darker in her expression, a glint akin to madness. I felt frozen, repulsed yet inexplicably enthralled as the guests dived back into the pool, laughing, not just out of fright but something far more exhilarating. One by one, they submerged themselves in the filth, sloshing around, as if they were high on the thrill of the taboo, ignoring the utter mess the water had become, convinced perhaps that it was part of the show, the night turning chaotic, desperate, and I just couldn't shake the feeling of having stepped into a nightmare that blurred the line between horror and sanctioned revelry. I turned to escape, only to find the patio packed tighter than before. People were laughing with abandon, and yet, a shadow passed over my heart as I caught Sasha's gaze locked onto me, a predator sizing up prey, manic joy reflecting back at me as if I were now part of their grotesque game, and as I stumbled backward, colliding with another guest, I realized there was no exit in sight. The laughter spiraled into something else, filled with the stench of something lost to reason. I hurried past the thrumming music, unable to swallow the reality that I had been lured into something twisted, a gathering gone wrong, but I still held on to the faint hope that I could amble my way back to freedom. The last tendrils of merriment faded into laughter that echoed ominously as I darted toward the edge of the pool, nightmares stirring around me, drowning in a fatal tide of laughter while I desperately clawed at the resin wrap of my sanity, knowing only that whatever mad party this was, it had become a twisted performance of the grotesque while I became the outsider watching as, to my horror, the party transformed into what felt like a crude ritual of acceptance, a cacophony of cheers rising above as I flailed toward the exit, realizing too late I had come to the wrong kind of party, one where they weren't merely pretending to revel in the chaos but had surrendered to it entirely, becoming entranced in something I couldn't fathom, and for them, it was the beginning of a ritual that made the horrors of the world pale in comparison. And in my panic to escape, among the forgotten stains of laughter, the realization hit me hard. To them, this was the best party ever, and perhaps that was the scariest part of it all. Once invited, you could never truly leave.
I had always been a proud, open-minded person, but the moment my husband suggested hosting his niece and her friends for a weekend, my heart sank into my stomach like a stone. "They're just kids," he said when I expressed my discomfort. "It'll be fun." I smiled weakly, but a knot twisted in my gut as I remembered the incidents that had taken place in our small town recently, reports of children disappearing, strange eyes watching from the shadows, whispers that drifted across the playground late at night. It wasn't the kids themselves I disliked, it was the haunting feeling that something was terribly wrong. The first night they arrived, laughter filled our home, but it was an eerie kind of laughter, one that clawed at my insides. The kids immediately started playing hide and seek, but not under the usual terms. They seemed to forget the boundaries, darting into rooms we hadn't even entered yet, giggling and peeking out like they knew secrets we didn't. I felt like a ghost in my own house, stuck in a nightmare where I was simultaneously an unwilling host and an invisible observer. When they invited me to join their game, my skin prickled. I declined, saying I had work to do, but that only seemed to amuse them more. Their eyes glinted in the soft glow of the living room lamp, and every time they glanced my way, it felt as if they were sharing silent jokes I wasn't privy to, a joke at my expense. As night fell and I tried to tuck myself into bed, the sounds of their whispers drifted through the cracked walls of our old house. I could have sworn I heard my name amidst their giggles, calling me out as if it was a part of their secret game. The next day, I decided to take a bold step and talk to my husband, laying out my worries, hoping he would see the truth of the situation. I just don't feel comfortable with them here, not with everything going on, I admitted, my heart racing as I spoke. He frowned, looking hurt, and I instantly regretted my honesty. So you're saying our niece and her friends are a danger? His voice was low and sharp like ice. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words felt too large for reality. He turned away, dismissing my fears as improbable paranoia. You're overreacting, he said, and I knew that our disagreement would hang over us like a dark avalanche waiting to fall. Throughout the day, I became more determined to keep an eye on the children. I watched them from down the hall as they congregated around the dining room table, shadows flickering across their excited faces. They moved in coordinated precision, sharing odd words in a language I couldn't understand. Each time I stepped closer, they'd hush immediately, their eyes locking onto me with a strange intensity, as if I was intruding on something sacred. That night, I lay in bed, too restless to sleep, replaying my husband's skeptical reaction. Was I really being paranoid? The thought twisted my gut. I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing sensation lingering in my mind, but then a soft tapping snagged my attention. I swung my legs around and crept to the doorway. Peering into the darkened hallway, I felt the icy fingers of dread wrap around my spine. It was just past midnight, and the house was eerily silent except for the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the living room. Curiosity washed over me, enough to nudge my feet forward. I crept toward the voices, heart pounding, and when I reached the dining room, my heart nearly stopped. The children were gathered in a tight circle around something. What were they doing? I squinted, trying to see past their small, interlocked bodies. Suddenly, one of the boys glanced over his shoulder, catching my eye. An unsettling grin spread across his face, and he beckoned me closer. Come join us. He chirped. Instinctively, I felt the air grow thick, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. No, I called out, my voice trembling. What are you doing? A round of giggles erupted, and the girl standing in the center lifted something high above her head, something glinting in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a stuffed animal, but it wasn't just any stuffed animal, its fur was soaked, dripping an unnatural shade of red that pooled onto the floor. Look! Another child exclaimed, excitedly pointing at the gory toy. It's alive! My heart raced, and panic surged through my veins as I stumbled backward. They were all looking at me now, their expressions shifting from giddy playfulness to something dark, something twisted. The insistent tapping of their fists against the table echoed in the stillness, a morbid rhythm that sent chills shooting down my spine. Wanna play? The girl asked, her voice now too sweet, almost mocking. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door, pressing my back against it as if it could shield me from whatever vile magic those children possessed. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but in the morning, the unease returned tenfold. As the sun rose, I slammed coffee into my system and finally confronted my husband again. You need to see what they're doing. They're playing with something. Wrong. His eyes narrowed in disbelief, but before he could respond, a raucous series of knocks shattered the morning calm. The children were outside, slamming their palms against the door, yelling my name, their voices rising to a pitch that felt like nails scraping against my skull. I opened the door to reveal them standing in a line, beaming smiles painted across their faces like they were in on a joke I wasn't. We want to play. They chanted in unison, their voices ringing like a nauseating choir. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and before I could reply, the boy in front pulled something from his pocket. It was a tattered piece of paper, and as he unfolded it, I recognized it all too well. "It's your name," he said, and my pulse quickened. It was an article written about the missing children of our town, my name marked at the bottom in a clumsy scrawl along with several others. "Join us in our secret, and you'll never want to leave," the girl chimed, and the invitation felt like a tether dragging me into an abyss. I slammed the door in their faces, trembling with anger and fear. My husband stormed in at that moment, demanding to know what was happening. I had never seen his face twisted with such concern. "Are you finally going to believe me?" I shouted, but he shook his head, his belief in me dwindling away like autumn leaves. I barricaded myself in our bedroom, praying, clutching my phone with trembling fingers, ready to call for help if it came to that, but I knew deep down that no one would believe me. The whispering began again, the shadows seemed to stretch further as I huddled against the closet door. Time blurred, and I didn't know how long I stayed there, locked in a never-ending spiral of fear, until I finally plucked up the courage to peek through the slightly ajar door. But the moment I did, an icy hand gripped my wrist, and those kids were there, back in my face, their smiles now wide and predatory, and they shifted like a sudden gust of wind as though they could melt right through the door. "You shouldn't have locked us out," the boy said, his voice echoing like distant thunder, and the last thing I remembered was screaming as the world crumbled into darkness around me, my consciousness slipping away as they slowly pulled me into their game. AITA for admitting I was uncomfortable. I now wondered, my voice echoing in the void, for there was no one left to hear me. I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter. It did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain, a dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like "just a loser" or "a standing ovation for Alex." Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl, the realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next, maybe adrenaline took over or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe, she was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing two cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. "They'll be fine," I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma," they chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in, yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination, but as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me, the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girl's eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. "So," I ask again, "AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets?"
I only hire cute girls or ugly guys at the college job I work, which might sound shallow, but I promise there's a reason for it. The campus coffee shop where I manage after classes isn't just a pit stop for caffeine, it's a breeding ground for something much darker, a place where beauty and awkwardness clash in ways that can only be explained through the bizarre experiences of the last 2 years. At first, it was innocent enough. I'd bring in a rotation of pretty girls hoping to catch the eye of someone or the awkward boys struggling to find their place in the social hierarchy. But then strange things began to happen. Certain regulars started to vanish, seemingly swallowed by the very air that filled the coffee shop, and the ones who remained developed eerie obsessions with our staff. The turning point was when Mia, a bubbly freshman with a smile that could light up a room, began to work shifts alongside Simon, a gangly guy with braces and a penchant for a cappella singing. The chemistry between them was palpable, but as their odd friendship blossomed, things began to unravel. Late at night, while cleaning up after closing, I'd hear whispers almost as if the shadows wanted to spill their secrets, but when I turned around, there was nothing, only the walls soaked in the sweat and laughter of stressed students and late-night study sessions. I shrugged it off until Mia didn't show up for her shift one rainy Thursday, a day when the storm was just loud enough to drown out my growing anxiety. I closed up early, thinking she might be sick or just trying to avoid the unpredictable weather. The next evening proved worse. Simon, anxious and jittery, was the only one manning the counter. He told me he hadn't seen Mia in 2 days, and the sinking feeling in my gut twisted tighter. The customers were acting strangely too, the appealing folks staring too long into the barista's eyes, intent as if they could suck something out of them, something human. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that with every new worker, a cute girl or an ugly guy, the shop blurred the lines of something sinister. Then came the night I saw the first signs of what I now know was the beginning of the end. I returned from the back room to find Simon speaking earnestly with a group of girls at the counter, their laughter wafting through the air thick with the smell of burnt espresso. One girl, with hair like molten gold and a radiant smile, kept glancing towards the entrance as if waiting for someone that would never walk through that door again. I should have stepped in, should have ended the facade right then and there, but curiosity gnawed at me, holding me in place. The laughter turned thick and indistinct, twisting into something darker, and in the next moment, Simon had begun to tremble. I thought he was just nervous, but soon his eyes were wide, pupils dilating as he stared off into the room's dim corners. It was then I felt it, a chill slithered up my spine, crawling like fingers reaching for my heart, dark shadows pressing in, and I finally understood, the whispers weren't mere figments, they were real. I needed to check on Mia. I rushed to her apartment, hardly thinking about what lay ahead. When I arrived, the door swung open easily, the hinges squeaking, revealing a scene I wish I could unsee. The room was empty save for a crumpled notebook lying face down on the floor. I picked it up, my heart racing. It contained Mia's thoughts on everything, the coffee shop, the friends she had made, and even a strange passage about an entity spiriting people away, a creature that fed on the essence of beauty and anxiety. My breath hitched in my throat, my mind raced, trying to piece it all together, trying to convince myself it was a delusion. I hurried back to the coffee shop, fearing for Simon and the others. The shop was quiet, the lights flickered as if the walls themselves sensed impending doom. When I reached the back, I found him standing rigid, staring at the wall, mumbling something about the door in the end. Panic flooded me. I pulled him away, demanded he look me in the eyes, but he just kept saying, "You can't look away, they'll come for you if you do." Suddenly, I felt it, a heavy presence looming, suffocating. It was there, creeping in from the shadows, and only then did I understand the terrible cycle. We lost a worker, and now the shop demanded another. Before I could react, Simon was pulled to the side, twisting away from me, his eyes wild with fear. He screamed as something unseen snatched him from reality. I stumbled back, terror gripping me tight as I clawed for the light. The door was my only escape, but as I turned, I glanced back at the counter one last time, and I saw it, a shape, Hauntingly beautiful yet horrifying, eyes as dark as pits and a smile that promised nothing but despair. There were whispers, seductive and luring, promising joy and delight, but all I felt was the grasp of night fragments consuming everyone I dared bring into the fold. I tore from the shop, bursting into the chilled night, and even now, this very moment, I can still hear the echoes of laughter mingled with screams, a reminder that my choices had given life to a predator only satisfied with beauty and loneliness. I don't work there anymore, I can't, but one thing remains: next semester, when the new hires come in, I'll still feel that haunting presence breathing down my neck, always waiting, always hungry. I have to tell you something that happened today, something I never thought would turn my entire life upside down in the span of just a few minutes, and believe me when I say it's going to sound insane, but I assure you it's true. Just 10 minutes ago, my dad found my pocket PC. Yeah, you heard that right, and let me explain before you judge, it's not what you think. I bought it a couple of weeks ago when I was feeling particularly lonely and curious about the whole thing, and I kept it hidden under a stack of old clothes in my closet, a place I thought was secure. Anyway, my dad, bless his heart, decided it was time to clean out the storage space in my room this morning. He's always been super practical, and he thinks that a clutter-free room equals a clutter-free mind. I was in the living room pretending to study because if I tried to stop him, I knew I'd have to admit I wasn't even working and that would mean more chores. So there I was, sweating bullets as I heard the telltale rustle of clothes being shifted around and then the unmistakable sound of plastic crinkling. That's when my heart started racing. It was only a matter of time before reality crashed down on me like an avalanche. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to remind him that sometimes it's better not to know. He wouldn't understand, or worse, he would judge me. But I just kept my mouth shut, too tortured by the anticipation. And then I heard it, the solid, resounding thump of the plastic hitting the floor. My stomach dropped, and I swear I could feel my heart pounding in my throat as the thought of him discovering it turned into a nightmare. I focused on the sound of the TV instead, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd dismiss it, thinking it was some weird toy or something left behind from when I was younger. But then, his footsteps started moving towards me, and my brain went into overdrive. Should I run? Should I pretend to be asleep? All I could think about was how he once told me that fathers should be a source of guidance and strength, not shame, but I felt so vulnerable at that moment. "Hey, come here for a second," he called out, his voice completely calm, and that only made my anxiety spike higher, wondering how on earth he could be so nonchalant about discovering his son's secret pleasure. I took a deep breath and stepped toward him, feeling like I was walking to my execution instead of just to the living room, and there he was, holding it in his massive hands like it was the strangest relic he'd ever found. "What's this?" he asked, and I could see it lying in the middle of the floor, glistening unnaturally yellow in the light, a horrifyingly intimate object that felt like a betrayal not just of my own privacy but of everything we'd ever shared. He didn't look angry, just bewildered, and I could only muster a weak, it's a toy. The embarrassment clawed at my throat, tightening like a noose as I tried to justify something that felt inherently unjustifiable. In that fleeting moment, all the thoughts of potential explanations ran through my mind. What would it even mean for him to know this side of me? But instead of outrage or disappointment, there was just this moment of awkward silence, a chasm opening between who I was, who I wanted to be, and who I knew he saw me as. "A toy for what?" he asked, eyes narrowing, not in judgment but in genuine confusion, and I swallowed hard, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes as my body reacted to both shame and fear in their most primal forms. I was hyper-aware of everything around us, the old family photos watching silently from the wall, the clock ticking away the precious seconds, and the very air growing thick with unspilled feelings. You know, when you're alone." I blurted out, my heart racing as the words escaped my lips, and I watched as his mouth fell open slightly in shock, and then something shifted in his gaze, not anger or judgment, but a kind of understanding, perhaps even empathy. "You know, son," he said slowly, almost hesitantly, "everyone has their ways of coping. I wasn't always this old and wise." It felt like the ground shifted beneath my feet, some kind of twisted normalization of the situation as he recounted awkward tales from his own youth, stumbling through the clumsiness of his teenage years in a way that reflected a shared humanity between us. It was still so surreal for me, the notion that he could ever relate to my experience in that way, but it also left me feeling exposed, like the last vestiges of my privacy had been stripped away. "Just next time, keep it hidden better," he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips as I somehow felt a sense of belonging resurfacing despite the very awkwardness of the moment. It was bizarre, shooting back into my brain like a jolt of disbelief that this conversation could even be happening. But then, as the words hung between us and the initial shock wore off, I sensed an undeniable echo in the silence that loomed afterward, as though despite the understanding, a shadow had crept in, reminding me that not everything can be normalized. There's a fine line between acceptance and envision, and I couldn't shake the thought that something unspoken loomed overhead now, like a dark cloud. What else about me might he find if he kept digging? What else had I left behind in the nooks and crannies of my life that could compel him to look deeper? And just like that, my mind spiraled into the terrain of paranoia, nurturing the seeds of worry that despite the light-hearted banner, I could never completely escape the judgment, or worse, the betrayal lurking just beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. 10 minutes had changed everything, torn apart the fabric of a simple father-son relationship and opened up a chasm of uncertainty. And just when I thought that maybe we could laugh this off and go back to the usual domestic grind, I realized I didn't even know how to face him now. How to reconcile the intimacy of that moment with my own vulnerability, and as I turned to escape the heavy burden of the room, I was left with an echo of something deeper, an unsettling reminder that no matter how light he intended to make it, I'd never look at that pocket PC the same way again, or my dad, or any part of my life that, for the first time, seemed irrevocably intertwined with secrets I could never shake off, leaving me to wonder how many more hidden things lay dormant in my existence, waiting to be brought into the light, as everything I thought I knew began to unravel, one uncomfortable revelation at a time. For the past 6 months, I've been living off McDonald's triple cheeseburger meal, and every day blurs into the next like a greasy streak on a sun-drenched diner window. It began as a challenge I unveiled on a viral TikTok, a promise to consume nothing but the greasy, cheesy beast and record my physical and mental decline, but as my body deteriorated and my mind became a playground for manic thoughts, the thrill turned into something much more sinister than I had anticipated. At first, the meals came with sugary sodas and salty fries on plastic trays, a symphony of crunch and savor, but each week it became harder to face the mounting grease slip that coated my tongue, increasingly swapping the carefree banter of my followers for whispers of their concerns, yet I assured them it was all in the name of content, of viewing the physical manifestation of obsession. Ironically, my dwindling health forced me to expand from mere indulgence to watching myself descend into an obsession with not just the burgers, but the restaurant and what it may be hiding. I started noticing little things, the way the golden arches shimmered unnaturally in the streetlights at night, how the store looked almost too perfect, like a grotesque replica of American life caught in some insidious feedback loop, and I became determined to stay away from the light, visiting the drive-thru late at night under the vengeful gaze of the moon, where I could indulge without the eyes of the world upon me. I could taste the salt of paranoia creeping into my meals, every bite whispering old conspiracies about fast food chains keeping their customers numb and compliant, and on that fateful night, I decided to stay until closing time. I slipped into a booth with my mountains of meals, convinced I would capture the magic of my madness, but as the hours dragged on, the employees began acting odd, voices hushed, glancing my way constantly as if debating something unfathomable, the beeping of the fryers blending into an uncanny rhythm that echoed between the walls like a heartbeat, and then I saw it, through the back door that occasionally swung ajar. Ominous shadows moved, figures draped in black, their whispers piercing through the fog of my fries like daggers, and for a moment they faced me inside their hurried movements. The way they palmed something shiny turned my stomach with dread. I felt like a curious child deciding to stretch the boundaries of bedtime, ignoring the warning of unseen monsters looming behind the threshold of reason, but curiosity proved fatal when, emboldened by desperation and madness, I slipped out to see what twisted operation lay hidden from sight. Crouched behind a dumpster, I did my best to blend into the stale smell of old grease, and what I saw ripped away the sanity I had briefly held onto as employees gathered in an unnatural circle, hands reaching out, their voices a low raspy chant in unison as they cradled small, fleshy bags, and my heart thundered in my chest when one of them lifted it for the moon to illuminate. It wasn't food, it was something, dare I say, alive, squirming against the fabric like something you would see in the darkest corners of nightmares, and I realized with dawning horror that the fries I had eaten day after day, the burgers that fed my obsession, were somehow part of this absurd ritual, and when they lifted their heads and locked eyes with me, I felt the ice of dread seep into my veins, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, a mocking expression that soured into fear as weighty silence fell over them, and instead of running, I froze, spellbound by the absurdity before me. I couldn't flee because, in the back of my mind, I understood that I was more than a customer. I had become part of their cult-like existence, a node in the machine that allowed them to thrive as I descended into gluttony and degradation, each meal gnawing away at my humanity, and just as I turned to flee, a harsh spotlight swung my way, blinding me momentarily, and when my vision cleared, they had vanished, leaving nothing but the stillness of night and the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I sprinted back home, my mind racing with maddened thoughts of an unspeakable truth, convinced I had run from something that had marked me. But no matter how far I escaped physically, I felt its cold fingers creeping deeper into my soul, a lingering taste of burnt beef and stale fries staining my very being, and in the days that followed, my cravings intensified as gnawing hunger gnawed at me. Each night, I found myself returning inexorably to the drive-thru, powerless and willing to ignore the awakening primal dread clawing at my insides, believing maybe the only way to confront this horror was to embrace it. Every sip of soda tasted richer, every burger slathered in too much grease and cheese felt like a bridge to a dark comfort zone, dragging me deeper into the cult of consumerism, a cyclone that held me hostage. And one night, the smell turned acrid as I pulled up, the familiar voices of the cashiers rang hollow, devoid of warmth or cheer, and when I placed my order, it became a mantra: 3 triple cheeseburger meals. Make it quick. But instead of the usual laughter that followed, silence swept over the restaurant, a veiling tension that sent shivers rippling across my skin. And then, as I bit into my burger, an unmistakable crunch echoed, followed by a soft thud. Chewing, I felt something distinctly different, and when I pulled away from the patty, I was met with a small, writhing mass, a tiny, squirming thing, alive and yet eerily familiar. My stomach dropped, a wave of horror cascading through me as reality smacked against the back of my head, and all I could think about was that I needed to get away. But instead, I found myself racing into the shadows once more, the identical drive-thru looming like a monstrous maw, and in that agonizing moment, I realized this deep-rooted desire for meat and darkness, wasn't going to let me go, and no matter how hard I tried to tackle the insatiable hunger gnawing at my sanity, I was drawn back toward those cursed arches, the memories of my gluttony becoming the final course of this grotesque feast. As I step back into the evening gloom trying to grapple with what has transpired, I can't help but reflect in a haze of dread that what started as a challenge, a dive into dietary absurdity, has now morphed into some agonizing cycle of survival at the mercy of a nightmare disguised by neon lights. Weeks go by as my days become shadows inside this mask, the grease staining my thoughts, the beckoning of the drive-thru haunting my every step, until I'm no longer living for the content but rather for every bite that echoes through the night, the truth coiling around me tighter than before. I am more than a man in a fast food frenzy, I'm becoming one of them, and as I catch my reflection in the window's sheen, the monster devouring what's left of me, I can only whisper, next time. Hoping I don't lose my soul to another late-night cravings. The day started like any other, the sun was barely peeking through the clouds, but I had my usual excuse ready, rehearsed to a T. I'm going to weld in the garage, sweetie. Just need to finish up a project. My daughter, with her unruly curls and bright smile, nodded enthusiastically, wrapped up in the world she created within her room filled with dolls and sketches, blissfully unaware of the real reason I shut the door behind me. You see, I wasn't welding, I was slipping outside to the garage not to work but to indulge in the devil's lettuce, that green escape that beckoned like a siren's call whenever the world became too much. I opened the garage door, the cool breeze catching my breath as I took out the neatly rolled joint from the hidden stash beneath an old toolbox. With a quick flick of my lighter, the flame danced to life, and I took that first puff, feeling the familiar haze wash over me. For a moment, I was free, floating somewhere above the mundane daily grind of life, of parenting, of being everything to my little girl. My mind, usually cluttered with responsibilities and worries, softened, and I let out a sigh of contentment, until I heard it. A soft whimper, a sound so pure that it cut through my tranquility like a knife. My heart dropped. I dropped the joint, scrambling toward the garage door, half expecting to see her standing at the threshold, tears staining her cheeks, but no, she wasn't there. I searched around, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it again, a faint cry, more pronounced this time, originating from the upstairs. Panic gripped me like icy fingers, and I rushed back inside, pushing the door open so fast it clanged against the wall. "Honey. Are you okay?" I called, my voice laced with a mix of fear and guilt. Silence. The air felt thick and oppressive as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood amplifying the tension. I reached her room, the door slightly ajar, and the sight that greeted me would haunt me for years to come. My daughter was kneeling on the floor, her dolls scattered around her, but it wasn't the mess that caught my attention, it was her face, contorted in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes were wide with terror, staring at something outside her window, something I couldn't see. I rushed inside, gripping her shoulders, trying to shake her from whatever trance had entranced her, but the moment I touched her, she screamed, a blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the house. "Daddy, no. Don't let it in," she cried, her tiny hands flailing as if to ward off an invisible intruder. I turned around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The bright afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating nothing more than the ordinary, yet I could feel an unease creeping down my spine like icy fingers. "Sweetheart, what do you see?" I asked, forcing my voice to be calm, though fear gnawed at me from the inside. "It's right there. You have to make it go away." I looked outside, only to be met with the serene image of our backyard. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the birds flitted about, blissfully unaware of whatever darkness plagued my daughter. "There's nothing there, baby. It's just your imagination," I reassured her, even as self-doubt began to creep in. But the way she shook her head was a dagger to my heart. She was adamant, petrified. "No, Daddy. It's looking at me. Please, please." Forcing her to face me, I held onto her, stifling my mounting dread. "Look at me, honey. It's just your imagination. There's nothing here. Let's play a game, we can color or watch a movie, anything you want," I offered, desperately attempting to steer her attention away. But the sounds from beyond the window were no longer her cries, they began to morph into whispers, strange, sibilant murmurs I couldn't comprehend. I pressed my eyes shut, anger flaring up. Maybe I was just a terrible father who let his daughter down and chose a high over her well-being. I leaned down, hugging her tightly, my heart racing a mile a minute as I whispered words of comfort. Just as I was about to suggest leaving the room, the atmosphere shifted. It felt charged with a sense of urgency, like a storm brewing just beyond our walls. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the window, its hues darkening, shadows stretching unnaturally. It was wrong. All wrong. The safety I had always taken for granted was suddenly in question. "Stay close to me," I said frantically, drawing her in tighter, but she squirmed against me, still fixated on that horrid thing outside. A chill coursed through the air as a dark figure, nothing more than a silhouette, slipped past the window's edge. I couldn't decipher features, but the aura of malevolence enveloped me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I realized I had completely lost sight of the world I once knew, everything had blurred. My daughter's eyes locked onto something behind me, and before I could react, she screamed again, her voice ringing with pure terror. "Daddy, it's behind you." Spinning around, I barely caught a glimpse of blackness retreating into the shadows of the hallway. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed my daughter, racing out of the room, determined to escape the nightmare festering within our home. I flung the door wide, and the staircase loomed ahead of me like a dark abyss. Each step felt heavier, weighed down by something I couldn't name. But the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate voices calling out to me, drawing me in, enticing me to return, to succumb to whatever dark pull pinned me to my daughter's side. "Run," I yelled as we navigated the first few stairs, my mind not processing the chaos erupting around us. The world felt twisted and morphed, every touch of familiar becoming foreign, the shadows casting threatening shapes against the wall. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, but I refused to let anything take her. I dashed to the door, flinging it open into the warm embrace of the outside world that felt deceptively innocuous. But as I stepped through, the whispers faded, the shadows retreated, and I found myself alone in the yard with my daughter, whose eyes reflected pure uncertainty. I had dragged her out of her nightmares, but at what cost? We stood there, panting under the sun, the weight of silence pressing down. The world around us began to normalize, but the unease lingered, not yet ready to let go. I could feel it watching us, lurking in dimensions I could not perceive. That evening, I made a vow to never abandon my little girl again for fleeting moments of reprieve. I would be the protector she needed. But as the days passed and shadows began to creep back into the corners of my mind, I began to wonder if perhaps those whispers had seduced me long before that day, enticing me to put my daughter at risk by seeking solace in substances meant to help me escape. And as I watched her play, blissfully unaware of the phrase in her father's soul, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread sinking deeper, gnawing at my heart, knowing that there were things far more sinister than any substance, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I was vulnerable enough to let them in.
For years, I prided myself on my ability to endure my friend Clara's so-called quirky behavior, the kind that often left me cringing, but I insisted to myself that everyone has their oddities and I should be accepting, even if her antics made me uncomfortable. It was Clara's signature thing to speak her thoughts aloud about everyone around us. It often felt more like a brutal commentary rather than quirky charm. Just last week at the cafe, she loudly mused about how the barista's skin seemed to glow in that weird artificial light and how she wouldn't trade her unique red-streaked hair for anything in the world while the barista flinched from embarrassment. I silently cursed the day Clara just decided it was okay to play social commentator without any filter, but I almost let it slide until her antics escalated at a party for another friend's birthday. As the night went on, her quirkiness spiraled into something I could no longer ignore when she leaned over to a group of us and declared that she, frankly, believed that most people's opinions were below her own, and even professed how she thought the birthday girl's dress made her look like a scuffed-up potato. As everyone squirmed in disbelief while Clara cackled at her own boldness, clearly oblivious to the growing discomfort around us, it was then that I snapped. Maybe it was the booze or the mounting unease, but I felt the pressure in my chest and the fire rising in my throat before I realized I had shouted out, "Ida, for telling you that your quirky behavior is just plain rude?" Silence fell over the room like an anvil crashing into a pool of water, and by the stunned expressions on our friends' faces, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread because I didn't know what would happen next. Clara's eyes turned to slits, and I could see a bewildered rage starting to bubble just beneath the surface as she processed what I had hurled at her. A tense moment passed before she laughed, but it was a sharp, humorless sound, cutting through the thick air like a knife. She straightened up, and the moment that followed was a cutthroat silence where every single one of our friends veered their eyes between us, unwilling to pick sides, but I could almost feel the ground shifting, the subtle change in energy that warned me I had awakened something far worse than awkwardness. Her voice dripped with venom as she launched into a tirade about how tired she was of people pretending to be happy and how incapable they were of being real, claiming that I was the one who needed to wake up and actually embrace the authenticity she so proudly represented. She painted me as the villain in my own story, shoving my character into a corner while she proclaimed herself as the fearless truth-teller, and everything spiraled from there. The rest of the party echoed her sentiments, turning their backs on me, and suddenly I found myself standing alone in the living room, humiliated while Clara reveled in her newfound role as the underdog champion of anti-niceties, and for a second, I found myself weighing every moment I had put up with her over the years. As I retreated to the bathroom, my heart thrumming wildly in my chest, I wiped my clammy hands on my jeans and stared at my reflection, feeling both relieved and tormented by my own impulsive outburst. Was I wrong? Regrettably, I couldn't shake this overwhelming cloud of guilt, knowing I might have misplaced my aggression towards her flippancy. The atmosphere outside was thick and moldy, mirroring the darkness brewing in my chest, but when I emerged to rejoin the throng of partygoers, something shifted in the air that arguably felt more sinister. Clara was still entertaining our friends, but something in her demeanor had soured. The edges of her smiles were sharp, and the way she was speaking had morphed into something unsettling, her eyes glinting with an unsettling mirth, and as if she drew strength from my moment of weakness, the comments she tossed flared deeper, aiming at our friends with precision, laced with an underlying current of malice that felt palpable. I tried to shake off the odd sensation creeping up behind me, a whispered warning flooding my gut, but as I left the party, I caught sight of Clara through the window, her gaze burning into my back as if she were carving my silhouette into the darkening night. Days passed, and each attempt to explain my perspective was met with confusion and rebuttal from mutual friends. They didn't see her for what she was. Desperate, I pulled one of the friends aside and asked if they noticed how my words had sparked a shift in Clara's behavior. His face paled, and he confessed that he'd seen Clara trying to turn seemingly innocent jokes into cruel barbs aimed at anyone who questioned her, that none of us were truly safe anymore. It felt like I had torn open a wound, exposing something dark and festering beneath the surface, and I wished I could just go back, apologize, and rewind time to prevent my slip from turning Clara's soiree into a breeding ground for her sadistic quips masquerading as humor. At that moment, Clara confronted me one last time before our mutual friends, and with chilling clarity, she stared down the crowded bar with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked me if I'd like to play a little game, and when I refused, she merely laughed, menacing and melodious, as she proclaimed how friendships are merely social contracts that can easily be broken. Suddenly the laughter around us fell like dead leaves, air thick with an unspoken terror that formed a pact in the back of my mind. I started getting messages, odd and cryptic from unknown numbers in the days that followed, with pictures of me snapped through blurry camera lenses. The first couple felt harmless, eerie at worst, that stirred up good old paranoia unlike anything I had felt previously, but when one simply read, "We are all friends until the mind cracks," then what? I realized that this wasn't merely Clara being annoyed, it was personal, a form of psychological warfare. It culminated that Friday night when I walked alone from my car, feeling the audience of unseen eyes on the back of my neck, creeping up my spine until I reached my front door, yet I still felt the safety of my home was nothing more than an illusion when I heard Clara's familiar laugh from somewhere in the shadows. Alone in my room amidst the anxious shrill of my heart, I resolved to cut ties, rid myself of Clara and all that she encompassed. But just as the decision crumbled to form in my mind, another message pinged on my phone, this time an audio recording where I could hear Clara's voice gently whispering my name over and over again, and instead of a sense of relief, all I felt was dread. She knew where I lived. My heart raced, thoughts spiraled out of control as panic squeezed my chest tighter and the oppressive thunk of my pulse hammered in my ears. I had awakened something in her, transformed her into something dark and unrecognizable, and I realized, in that very moment, as I sat paralyzed and alone, a chilling truth sunk in. I had ignited a storm, and there was no turning back. The laughter would only grow louder. So tell me, was I wrong for attempting to call her out? Or did I unknowingly summon the very monster I attempted to escape? As the lights flickered overhead, a shadow danced along the wall, and I realized in horror that sometimes, the line between quirky and cruel is drawn in blood, and I was right in the center, and it wasn't over yet.
I have major daddy issues that molded me into who I am today, and it all started the summer I turned 11. That's when my father, a jovial man with a bellowing laugh and an unapologetically booming personality, vanished from my life without warning, leaving only a note that felt more like a sinister riddle than a farewell: find me in the shadows. My mother, fragile and devoid of her former brightness, became a ghost in our house, her silence speaking volumes about her heartbreak and my insatiable curiosity. I spent the next few weeks searching for answers in every crevice of our old Victorian home, the attic where I discovered a wrapped shoebox filled with my father's belongings, Polaroids of him with strangers, cryptic letters, and a worn-out pocket watch that ticked off the seconds like they were taunting my insecurities. It felt as if those remnants had been imbued with an aura of guilt and dread. I convinced myself that he wasn't dead but rather lost among the shadows, waiting for the day I would find him. I grew up chasing ghosts, eyes darting down dark alleys and desolate corners where light barely touched, certain that if I just looked hard enough, I'd uncover the truth behind his departure. Each failed attempt deepened the wound, and as adolescence hit me hard with a rush of insecurities, I turned to unhealthy relationships, starving for validation wherever I could find it. The first boy who told me I was beautiful became my world. But when he ghosted me like my father had, I hollowed out even further, my heart breaking each time another guy tried to earn my trust only to shatter it like fine porcelain. The summer after high school ended, as I was desperately trying to forge a new identity from the shards of my past, I made a pact with a friend to attend a party at an abandoned warehouse, where the rumor was that ghosts lingered, the kind that spoke of lost loves and unresolved familial issues. I brushed off the idea as ridiculous, but with a drink in my hand and traces of freedom on my lips, I followed a group into those hallowed halls where the music pulsed like a living entity, and the air throbbed with unexplainable tension. It was there, beneath flickering lights and haunting whispers, that I met him, a charismatic stranger who seemed to see straight into my fractured soul. He introduced himself simply as Jake, with eyes that glinted with a familiar mischief, his smile laced with secrets that drew me in like a moth to flame. He never asked about my past, instead, he listened to my nightmarish stories as if he were savoring each word, pulling me deeper into an intoxicating spiral of laughter and shared secrets. Yet, the more I opened up about my father's disappearance, the more Jake seemed unsettled, his gaze flitting to the darkness just beyond the reach of light. One night, while we wandered through abandoned neighborhoods, I impulsively suggested we hunt for ghosts, half seriously hoping to catch a glimpse of my dad. Jake smiled, albeit with a tinge of hesitation, and led me to a desolate park where the moon cast eerie shadows among the trees, the chilling silence blanketing us like an ominous presence waiting to be awakened. As Jake recounted tales of lost spirits, I felt an unexpected surge of hope, convinced that this would be the night I'd confront my past and find my dad. Hours slipped away like sand through our fingers, and just as the clock struck midnight, the air turned ice cold. The dark branches seemed to sway like skeletal fingers beckoning us closer, and for the first time, I felt the weight of expectation on my shoulders. "What if he's right there, watching you?" Jake whispered, his voice sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, half expecting my father to emerge from the shadows, but instead, it was a spectral vision, my father, looking every bit the same as I remembered, except his empty eyes were now gunmetal gray, filled with a mix of meaning and torment. I trembled, my heart pounding against my ribs as I reached out for him, but the air around me thickened with an unfathomable dread. Jake's expression shifted from admiration to fear, and before I could comprehend what was happening, He screamed for me to run. I felt the darkness surge, twisting and pulling at my sanity, and I bolted back through the park while the looming figure of my father faded further into the shadows, an unfulfilled promise lingering in the air. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a pit of despair, questioning everything and everyone. Jake, who had seemed to understand me so well, became another ghost. It was only later, when I came across the very pocket watch from the attic at a garage sale, that the horror unfolded. Its broken chime rang through my mind as if awakening memories buried deep. Every tick became a reminder of my father's absence, dragging forth the realization that the truth lay not in the shadows of my childhood but in the reflection of the man I had compromised myself to be. I never saw Jake again, not in this world or the next, but his words echoed in my mind like a haunting whisper, reminding me that my daddy issues were not just about abandonment, they were about the shadows I carried, shaping me into someone who searched for love in all the wrong places. It's been years, but I'm still haunted, forever trapped in a cycle of seeking those familiar patterns, the echoes of my father's laughter, and the lingering question, will I ever be enough for someone to stay?
When my friend Sarah made the comment about my girlfriend Lisa being the token Asian, I felt the air grow thick with tension, as if someone had just whispered dark secrets in a crowded room, every eye quickly averting to look anywhere but at me. We were at a bar, surrounded by laughter and chatter, the kind of casual Friday night that usually brought the best out of people, but suddenly I felt like I was trapped in a scene of a horror movie where something sinister lurked just beneath the surface. I glanced at Lisa, who had been animatedly discussing her passion for pottery before Sarah's comments disrupted her flow, and her smile faded, replaced by a mask of confusion and hurt that twisted my stomach into knots. It was as if a storm had swept through, leaving only the debris of my friend's thoughtlessness behind, and I could sense anger rising in me, a primal reaction against the ignorance that seemed to lace Sarah's words. "What the hell did you just say?" I shot back, my voice a little louder than I intended, drawing the attention of nearby patrons who peered up from their drinks, eyes wide as they waited for the unfolding drama. The uncomfortable silence that enveloped our table felt electric, but I refused to let Sarah dismiss this as a joke, a little quip in what was supposed to be a friendly gathering. "You can't just say those things," I continued, heart pounding, the heat of embarrassment and rage pulsing through me, imagining Lisa's discomfort as if it were my own, the disbelief on her face cutting me deeper than any knife. Sarah's face turned a shade of red that echoed the shame she clearly wasn't feeling as she sputtered out a defense that made the situation worse, insisting she was just being funny and that I was overreacting. I thought about how Lisa had shared stories of her battles against subtle racism and microaggressions, the times she'd struggled to be seen as more than just a stereotype, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a careless remark, it was about the ways society reduced people to labels and jokes that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. A palpable tension hung thick between us, as Sarah's entourage murmured awkwardly, clearly caught between wanting to support her and acknowledging that what she said was deeply out of line. I turned to Lisa, who was now looking down at her untouched drink, the smile that used to brighten her face replaced by an expression of disappointment, making my heart ache for her, wishing I could shield her from the ignorance I deemed unworthy of a real friend. When I shot Sarah a glare that must have conveyed 1,000 unsaid words, I noticed a flicker of realization cross her face, perhaps a brief moment where she understood the gravity of her insensitivity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the joviality of the evening, she tried to laugh it off, cracking a joke that fell flat in the thick air between us, but I could see the hints of defensiveness edging back into her demeanor, and I realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a window into the fractures of our friendship laid bare, like a raw wound festering under the guise of normalcy. I didn't want to confront her pride at the expense of my relationship with Lisa, but I couldn't sit there and pretend it didn't happen either. The evening curled into a ball of chaos, laughter replaced by awkward shifting in seats, as everyone seemed to tiptoe around me and Lisa, waiting for fallout that hung over us like dark clouds. I remember feeling the flame of anger cool slightly, churning into something deeper, a fierce protective instinct taking root in my chest, compelling me to stand up for Lisa not just because she was my girlfriend, but because she deserved to exist in a world that appreciated her complexity, her beauty, her cultural identity, rather than dismissing her as a punchline. "It's not a joke if it hurts someone else," I finally said, my voice softening but laced with steel, drawing Lisa's eyes toward mine, and in that pregnant silence, I watched as a shared understanding dawned on her face, a flicker of gratitude that made all the chaos worthwhile. Sarah huffed, her demeanor shifting from defensive to wounded, and I caught sight of tears brimming at the edges of her eyes. But I wasn't here to soothe her guilt, I was here to advocate for the woman I loved, and that was my priority until my last breath. The confrontation caught everyone off guard, turning their drinks into props in a tragic play unfolding right before them, and I thought about how desperately we cling to the comfort of ignorance, how the need to be liked sometimes makes us forget our humanity. The conversation wended onward, but it was clear that something had shifted irreparably. We finished our drinks and left, Lisa and I walking in silence through the night air that felt heavier than it had moments ago, but also liberating, as if in confronting the harsh absurdities of our reality, we unearthed a bond far deeper than I had imagined we were capable of sharing. As we reached the car, I could sense a beautiful understanding forging between us, and I dared to hope it might be a step towards healing the bruises that had marked both our hearts and our interactions in a world where sometimes, standing up means stepping away from the toxic comfort of friendship for the sake of love.
I woke up today with a heavy chest, the kind of weight that sits on you like a bad dream refusing to fade, and I knew it was the day I had finally decided to take action, an end to the pain that had become my life. I lived in a constant haze of despair, marked by the spiral of isolation and anxiety that had consumed me over the past few months, painted in shades of gray that dulled the edges of everything I used to love. At my lowest, I sketched it all out in my mind, an escape plan that had taken shape in the bleak recesses of my thoughts. I spent the day preparing, gathering items that would make this shadowy decision a simpler affair, a rope hidden in the garage, a few well-placed notes for my family that I hoped would convey my love amidst my departure. I didn't want any grand send-off. I only desired a quiet end to my struggle, something serene, beautiful even, like the closure of a book you couldn't put down because it hurt too much to read. My close friend, Jacob, texted me that morning, completely unaware of my plans, inviting me to one of his late-night sonatas that I had skipped countless times before. I almost laughed at how normal everything felt, my heart aching with unfulfilled longing to simply say yes and join him, but I quickly silenced the thought. Instead, I prepared myself for the night ahead, making sure to plot a route that would lead me straight back home after I said my goodbyes. There was a tension in the air as evening fell, an electricity that pulsed through me, intertwining with fear and a sickening sense of relief. When I arrived at Jacob's house, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight and hushed laughter, his eyes lit up as he embraced me tightly, pulling me into the warmth of his company, even as I felt myself slipping further away into the dark corners of my mind. The music floated like a haunting melody, sometimes soothing, sometimes unsettling, and I lost myself in thought, imagining what would happen as soon as I left the gathering. Jacob played beautifully, pouring his heart into the instrument that had woven so many memories for us, each note resting heavy in the air, laden with unsaid words. I felt the pulse of something within me, a wavering heartbeat of hope rising up just as quickly as my resolve crumbled, and I knew then that I had to leave without him ever knowing. But just as I stood to slip away, I heard him call my name, a simple word that shattered my carefully crafted facade. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etching itself onto his face, and I forced a smile, telling him about the usual stresses of life, pretending the weight on my chest didn't threaten to crush me. Jacob stared into my eyes as if searching for answers I couldn't give him, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze, as if he knew more than I had let on. I didn't want to burden him with my demons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more aware of my darkness than I realized. After a while, he pulled me aside, away from the lively banter of our friends, and shared a story, one he said had changed his perspective on life. It was about hope, resilience, and the simple fact that when someone is in despair, a single person can spark a series of events that alters their fate completely. The words wrapped around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, as I felt the duality of my decision weigh against the importance of his message. Just then, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat, a cosmic joke. A signal from the universe that I had yet to grasp fully. My mind skittered back to my plans, and with each passing second, I felt the binds of my resolve loosening under the weight of his sincerity. When the lights returned, I caught a glimpse of something almost imperceptible within Jacob's eyes, a glimmer of intuition that set my skin alight and kindled a hesitant flame of connection I thought lost, an understanding beyond the surface. It broke something in me, and suddenly, I couldn't think about slipping away, because he had wrenched me back from the edge just by being there. Without even knowing it. I didn't tell him about my thoughts of escape, perhaps I didn't need to. The truth was, I'd been standing on the precipice, peering into an abyss that whispered promises of peace, and he had somehow illuminated the darker paths with his presence. By the end of the night, I made a promise to myself, to reach out, to talk more, to still the whisperings of despair that loomed so constantly in my life. As we parted ways, Jacob smiled and hugged me again. But this time it felt different. This time, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that maybe I was worth saving. I didn't know how deep the shadow went, or if I'd ever fully escape, but with friends like him, maybe I wouldn't have to fight the darkness alone anymore. Later that night, lying in bed, I could feel the old weight still hanging around, but somehow it felt lighter, like a burden shared rather than one I carried alone. I drifted into sleep with a flicker of something resembling hope, not knowing that every note of love and joy wrapped in those melodies had silently crept into the corners of my heart, saving me from what could have been my final attempt today.